lot of people know that you have 230,000 followers on X, but not everyone knows about your medical adhesive business. For all the aspiring entrepreneurs listening to this, how important are Tai Chi and red wine in developing the perfect product?
Oh, man, in developing the perfect product, I would say for me, those were that was the pivotal moment for me, which is you heard this story, but I got frustrated with this product design, right? So this is a way back when in college. It was actually only a few years ago, but it feels like it was way back when. But I came up with a Band-Aid package design that was novel. It actually came to me in a dream, and I'm not joking. I was deer hunting and I had a dream. And in the dream, I had this idea for a Band-Aid. I wrote it on napkin. And when I pitched it, the people said it was a really dumb idea. I found a person to pitch to, first off, which is a whole thing. They said it was a dumb idea. Then they came back to it, said they want to fund it. And then we got like, I don't know, a few $1,000 in, and they were like, look at this patent. And it was the same product that I came up with. It's the exact same design. But the problem was still there because that product wasn't on the shelves anywhere. You couldn't buy it. And so one night I just was like, all right, I'm going to like just drink wine and stay up all night. And I'm just going to continue just like trying to figure out how to problem solve this. And eventually, literally, I felt like my spirit being like, you need to go outside. And so I planted my feet in the soil barefoot. And my wife is probably like, he's officially lost it at this point. But I have Band-Aid wrappers everywhere inside. I'm outside and my feet are in the soil. And I'm like doing my breathing and Tai Chi movements and I'm kind of praying. And then all of a sudden it was like, boom, the design came. Totally changed the design, but totally solved the problem too, because we had manufacturing issues that we were dealing with. So for me, if you guys, for any entrepreneurs who are inventing something, if you get stuck, little red wine, bottom shelf is preferred. Little Tai Chi, stay up late, you'll probably find some.
Yeah, you mentioned that it had originally come to you in a dream. I know a lot of inventions that they happen that way, like the periodic table, the sewing machine, Einstein's theory of relativity, all started in dreams. Do you think our subconscious is always trying to pass along things to help us create?
Oh, I think that's one way to say it. I think another way to think about it is that they say it's roughly 3% of your brain is conscious. Well, there's 97% that's also calculating, right? And also running in the background, kind of like a background software. And I think in those, I believe it's hypnopompic states, which is when you're just falling asleep. You're kind of mixing between that conscious and unconscious. So speaking of, not Einstein, who's the famous inventor, invented the light bulb? Oh my goodness, Thomas Edison, for Pete's sake. Thomas Edison, he had a technique where he would hold a steel ball and he had a big steel plate on the ground and he would hold it and he would doze off. And when the ball would fall out of his hand, that's when he would basically fall asleep, is because you relax when you fall asleep. The ball would slap and wake him up and he would just write down the first thing that he would think of, because he tried to engage with that hypnopompic state, right? When you're falling asleep, you're kind of mixing, I believe it's theta brainwaves that you're in, but it's totally true. Dream states are fascinating because you can play with reality in a way that normally is I want to say inaccessible, but I would say generally inaccessible to people. So I thought that was fascinating. There's a bunch of inventors who have done that, by the way.
Yeah, I've wanted to play around with lucid dreaming a little bit because of that exact thing where you're in this like pure state of pure creativity almost, where you can do anything and you're
Yeah.
aware that you're not in this dimension, and you can tap into something that you just can't tap into when you're normally uh awake. But there's also like an intentionality behind things that we want to create and things that we want to do. And I know there was one day where you wanted to take off from your job and you were just going to relax, but you ended up being like, you know what, I'm just going to sell. Like something came over you and you were like, I'm going to sell, to the end of the day, or until I make, until I get my
Yeah.
first client. And on your 75th call, you ended up closing one of your old coaches on like a Twitter growth
Yeah.
package. Have you always had this sort of like entrepreneurial bug to just go and create something and build and sell, or is that a more recent phenomenon?
Yeah. It's recently manifested that way, but I have always loved puzzles and problem solving. Um, One of my favorite feelings as a kid was stacking firewood. That was my job, as I would chop and stack firewood. And I always remember at the end of a stack of firewood, you sit back and you look at it and you're like, that's a thing. I did a thing. You know what I mean? There was something tactile about it. And so um, I would say entrepreneurial wise, I actually have, as I think about it, I got busted in 6th grade. I was selling, you remember those sick hemp necklaces
Yep.
with like the big glass beads? I was like slinging those like 15 bucks a piece. I made like 100 some dollars in a day, and then I got busted, dude. And one of my friends was like, they don't want us to be businessmen.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in the current iteration, it's looking like a lot of entrepreneurial pursuit, a lot of systems thinking and problem solving. Streamlining systems has basically been my endeavor recently.
I'm kind of the same way. Well, I guess I never really had that like that younger years, like slinging candy bars or hemp necklaces.
Yeah.
Um, it's definitely been more recent. Like there's something about the internet and maybe just about the world in general that I'm like, I see an opportunity and it's more like I'm opportunistic more than I've been entrepreneurial, but those somehow have just overlapped now. And that's
Yeah.
brought me to X where I see like a ton of opportunity. And I've really tried to put myself out there as much as possible. And that kind of brings me to your first tweet ever, at least on this account, which
Oh yeah.
was on June 1st, 2022. And it was, we speak ourselves into the world. And I'm curious, what did you mean by that?
That's
And
like
how do
I
you see
forgot,
X
man.
and how do you see X as a vehicle for speaking ourselves into the world?
Mm, that's a that's better than I would have guessed. I would have guessed it was something really dumb. That's a really pithy quote. We speak ourselves into the world. So I had a flip phone for about a decade prior to being on social media. I didn't have any social media accounts. I had Proton Mail locked down, meaning I was not a social media guy. You know what I mean? Um, and there was a pivot that happened for me when I started doing web design, and I started freelancing web design. The guy who I was doing that with, the coaching program, he said, you got to make a Twitter. There's a lot of opportunity in tech Twitter, which there is. It's a fantastic ecosystem. And I realized that so many of the people that I look up to, I would almost say all of the people that I look up to, really, the only reason I know about them is because they decided to speak. And so there's something about articulate speech that establishes, this is Jordan Peterson-esque, but it's like it establishes order out of the chaos that is the randomness of life, right? And so I think with that first tweet, what I was getting at is I'm like, I'm not going to hemlock in silence anymore. I'm going to start sharing. I'm going to start talking and start actually expressing my ideas as they are, right? And that it takes a level of bravery. So it's almost like a flag in the ground. It feels like,
I obviously resonate with that immensely. Most of my brand has to do with speaking. I think that,
yeah,
um, but even if it's writing, I think any way that we can kind of use our words to kind of develop our thoughts and then put them out there, that really like it helps us grow and it helps other people grow.
yeah,
I've heard you say that one of the cool parts about personal branding is that it gives you the opportunity to self-select the people who will benefit the most from you bringing your best self into the
absolutely.
world. So when it comes to like building out that ecosystem, um, how do you see content creation as a vehicle for self-development?
So it reminds me of marketing, where marketing and content creation, your content creation and your marketing are almost the same. They're almost indistinguishable, right? Because you're producing content that creates an outcome, but the content itself is also the product, right? So there's almost a virtuous cycle that happens. And I think for creation of content and like self-discovery and personal growth, I don't know if you can realistically create heartfelt, resonant content without deep introspection. I mean, unless you're just freaking slinging them, you know what I mean? Which is fine too. But if you're really trying to connect with people's hearts, the quote I read one time was, if you want to touch people's hearts, you need to first let them touch yours. And I thought that was a really apt quote, because you're putting your ideas out there for judgment or for praise. And you kind of realize quickly, praise and judgment are almost the same. What you're really doing is you're discovering yourself. Really, they're really irrelevant. You know what I mean? You're gonna have haters. You're gonna have people who worship you. It's they're one and the same, right? I think John Wooden said that praise and criticism are the same poison, and I think that really manifests itself in social media as well. But for me, the content creation, it's helped me refine my ideas and also see what resonates the most with me, you know? Like when you do a post, sometimes you come back to it a month later and you go, what was I even saying? And then other times you're like, dang, that rips, dude. Like that first tweet, I'm like, I should repost that. That's a great line.
Yeah, I found that there's a lot of like hard skills that you build as well. And then testing your ideas, kind of to your point, when you put your ideas out into the market and you get the real-time feedback, and it forces you to question yourself and kind of where you actually stand on certain issues. Did I even mean that? Was I just saying that? Or if I did mean that, why does no one else agree or care? Is it because my writing was bad? Is it because the idea was bad? And you have this like instant feedback loop. It's super powerful, where I feel like in the last year and a half of being on X, I've grown just as much as maybe the 5 years before that, for so many reasons across the board. Part of it's the people that I look up to and I emulate and I get involved with. Um, when you first got in to the scene, I know you had seen like J.K. Molina had mentioned ghostwriting, and it kind of piqued your interest. And then you went into Dakota Robertson's first Growth Ghost cohort. Um, from an education perspective, do you think that the education system is really shifting into that like cohort model, the online course model, or are we in some sort of money X bubble where we just kind of, this is just the way it is here? Or do you think that bleeds out kind of into the real world?
I think that any education system that doesn't have real world value is destined to fail. I think that's basically what it comes down to. The reason that X is having success, and for example, money Twitter, tech Twitter is the same. There are tons of people who are learning coding from resources that they found on X, and they're making great money, right? No formal education. They're teaching themselves. So I think transformation and value, like real market value and actually solving problems, is so much more tactile and actually, at the end of the day, sustainable. Because, there's not really busy work when you're an entrepreneur always. Like what you're doing is everything's a needle mover. It's just about how much leverage is each move. Does that make sense? And so as people realize that in the marketplace, a good idea doesn't mean it's going to sell, for example, um, or having a degree doesn't necessarily translate to a high paying profession, because most of the learning you're doing is actual hands-on learning. I think that's what X really shines at right now, is that there's so much access to people who are actively doing it and are sharing how they did it, and opening. I mean, it's a great privilege, right? All of the cohorts and classes and mentors that I've hired, I've done so because it's a strategic move toward a strategic end, right? That's far different than just saying I'm going to get a certain degree and then see what happens, right? It's a lot more targeted, and for that reason, it's a lot more lean. So from a manufacturing standpoint, it seems like it's a lot. You're able to pivot as you need to without the repercussions, without being, for example, 3 years into an undergrad in a degree that you're not going to be able to use. It's hard to pivot that far in, and you already owe debt. You know what I mean? Versus you can kind of experiment. My first Twitter course was AOP's Art of Purposes, Create 24/7. Right? It was like, I think it was like 35 or $40 at the time, maybe a little bit more. But that was my first taste of learning about how the Twitter ecosystem works. Right? That's a very modest threshold. It doesn't take a lot, and from there it scaled, and I learned that there were more people teaching certain things, niche down to specific skill sets, made connections with those skill set teachers and mentors. And so, yeah, for people who are hungry for entrepreneurial pursuit, there's just such an ecosystem for it, because really there's so many niches and there's so much opportunity that it's hard to miss, to be honest. It gets a little tiring. You're like, dang, how many like I did a brief stint looking at ecom, and I'm like, man, I'm not gonna dive into ecom, but it's all right here. It's just fascinating how you could, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of great points, particularly, first of all, the pricing, where when you compare it to the old education model, it's just many orders of magnitude cheaper to find the systems that are working more in real time than maybe some of these antiquated models that being taught in textbooks that take years to come up with. You wait a couple of months on X and you've already missed kind of that next meta or that next wave of like how things are actually reaching the audience, which ultimately is the game, right? Is this game of attention. And the other thing is the kind of the targeting, particularly with like who's teaching you. um, you know with your degree, let's say, you're kind of like you said, just going after like a degree in whatever. And it's maybe in select cases, but the vast majority of the time, it's just kind of whoever the professor is the professor. And you don't really know too much about what they've done or who they are or how they teach, or if you resonate with them. Whereas on X, you're basically like hand selecting people or groups of people that you really connect with and understand. So I'm curious about, you took that kind of interest in ghostwriting and you've made a whole career out of it. You worked with a couple of the top agencies on X and beyond, Taylin, Simmonds, and Legacy Builder. How have you found ghostwriting as a career? And do you think it's a good option for newer creators to explore?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a fantastic career. I think there's a lot of opportunity for it just because of the exactly what you mentioned about attention. And the other thing that is important to keep in mind is that ghostwriting is not one dimensional. It's not one thing. Ghostwriting, it's an interesting term, to be honest. Really, what it is marketing, content marketing, right? So either you're writing on behalf of someone or you're writing on behalf of a business. Um, but for people who want to get into it, my recommendation is to find as niche as niche down as you can find that is still a tolerable market hunger, right? So meaning if you only ghostwrite for pistachio farmers west of the Mississippi, you're gonna have a very small target audience, right? You can't be too niche. But I've seen people who are very successful selecting either email, LinkedIn, Twitter, landing page copy, VSL copy. Um, so it's kind of like copywriting at the end of the day. Um, but like I said before, there are mentors for any one of those, right? There are people who are doing it at a high level in all of those domains. And so, yeah, for somebody who's interested in ghostwriting, I think the best place to start is really with your own content. Start writing for yourself. So now in the position where looking at hiring, what we're looking for in hires and potential people to work with, show us what you've done, right? It's not a degree we're looking for, not even close, right? It's tell me an example of something you read that you wrote, or here's a test. I'm going to give you a sample prompt, and I'd like you to respond back to me with how you would go about creating an engaging piece of content for that. Notice how practical that is, and how it really puts you on a real world test instead of just saying, well, you were esteemed by these professors or whatever. It's not that proxy environment. It's much more real time. And what you'll notice too, if you're getting into ghostwriting, a lot of them start as freelance, right? So you begin as a freelance writer or you set yourself up. But in order to do that, the skills you learn along the way, you have to learn to set up a business. How do you set up a business? How do you do taxes? How do I format my finances so that I don't end up, hurting myself down the road? How do I organize myself on a daily basis? What kind of technology do I need? These are all questions that, in a college setting, they might answer those for you and provide you with the resources. But in this setting, you're going to have to just kind of grab the bull by the horns and do it yourself. And I think there's a lot of ownership and a lot of self-respect that comes with that too, if you're successful.
Yeah, and I am a perfect. I mean, I basically lived exactly what you're saying as far as being able to work for somebody as a ghostwriter. A lot of people don't know this, but I had a major ghostwriting client, someone that we all know on X, and the way that I got that job was I had been going viral with my own threads, and I basically just put together like a banger cold email and was just like, I see you, you could use this. You were saying you needed this. Here is a bunch of my work, and I made it in a nice clean format, punchy, and then a bunch of stuff that I'd actually done. And I was on a call with them the next day and worked with them for many months. I also reached out similarly to Dan Coe, and we were talking for a little bit. So there you can get in front of really successful people if you have that real world experience, and then you all of a sudden you find yourself writing for people that you're learning from, right? And because these people, the people that have the money to spend on ghostwriters, are people that are doing things in real life that they don't have the time, but they do have the money. And so their expertise and their wisdom, you get to actually start studying that as the writer, as you take on their voice. I know you've written for a ton of successful people, CEOs, founders, athletes. And you said that I have yet to find a single one that didn't do one thing for an unreasonably long time.
Yep.
Can you speak to the power of stamina and endurance as a creator as we figure out our path?
Oh yeah, that's a hard one. The reason it's hard is in business, you're always running the balance of ROI. You're always trying to sort out what's the return on investment, what's the asymmetry of the bet, right? The goal is to line yourself up with asymmetrical bets where the output is much higher than the input, right? If I work for this many hours, I'm able to earn this much, or you know what I mean, that kind of setup. I think stamina as it pertains to growing on a social media platform is figuring out what is resonant for you on a long-term basis. And that's a very hard thing to know before diving in, right? So for example, people are quite inaccurate about assuming how much they could accomplish if they were to be, if push came to shove, right? A good example is a friend of mine who had never ran more than a half mile. I was talking about doing a marathon. I said, you should do a marathon with me. He's like, I can't do that. I can't even run a mile. I'm like, let's get our shoes on. Let's take a whole day and let's just see how far we can go. You don't need to keep track. We'll talk, we'll jog. We ended up running 15 miles and not just sprinting, right? A couple walks every now and then, little break for water, but 15 miles compared to I can't run 1 mile. I think that's the truth for building on social media and also building business as well. You're capable of much more than you actually recognize, but it's the action of doing it that allows you to build that self-trust. The other piece too is that you don't understand the landscape until you're in it for a little while. There's a time element that I don't know how to compress. So for me, I started my first Twitter profile. It was in January 2022, and I didn't make $1 until I believe it was August 2022, right? And I was spending 30 minutes to an hour and a half a day on Twitter, right? This is deep in it, right? But you need to learn who are the players, who are the relevant voices in the field that you need to make connections with. How do you make connections with them, right? Because I don't know about you, but I've sent many a cringy DM in my day. So you learn, right? You learn how what's the language here? How do you operate here? Who are the people I want to be in contact with? And then you also have to have a vision. I think that having a goal in mind, even if it's not an ideal goal, right? Even if it's just a clear outcome that would qualify as success in your mind, that helps you keep oriented. Because on the day to day, the grind is the grind. That's the reality. And so for me, like I was mentioning, I hadn't decided on ghostwriting for a while, but I was dedicated to the process of figuring out. I know there are people doing this online. I know there are people on X who establish themselves an authority and then take that authority and present it, and they can earn reimbursement back, and it creates a virtuous cycle. I would like to do that. How do I do that? And it took 8 months, right, of daily posting and daily content. And like I said about the an unreasonable time period, I had a lot of people who were like, man, what happened? Dude, you got a flip phone? Now you're on Twitter every day? What the heck? Like, I had a lot of people in my life that didn't understand it, which is okay. And I think that's part of the process too, is going through a period where just like the hero has to leave the hometown and probably receive some friction while doing that, because it's a sense of loss. There's a sense of loss that you go through in self-testing where you're like, am I good enough? Am I doing the right thing? The balance there is that sometimes you're not. So you got to be able to, you got to be self-aware enough to know when you actually do need to pivot, which is also challenging. But I would say my answer for that, for if someone's listening and they're thinking, how do I know? Look back at yourself. If your tendency is to stay too long, you probably need to pivot sooner rather than you feel like it. If your tendency is to pivot too fast, you probably need to stick with it longer than is comfortable. Notice the common denominator. It's past the point of comfort. I think that's the main takeaway there.
Interesting. I always think back to something Kieran Drew once said to me, which is follow your energy. And I think
Yep.
sometimes there's no right answer about whether to stop or to keep going, but it's about what am I truly passionate about? What gives me joy? What gives me energy? And are the people around me people that, I resonate with? And I think if you just keep pushing, you can kind of make anything happen if you go long enough at it. But it's like,
Yeah.
is it something you actually want, or is it something that you're telling yourself that you want? And I've definitely struggled with that. But I think just kind of just pushing through and pushing through. I kind of wanted to, this is along the same lines, but like from stamina perspective, I know that you built a sauna in your backyard with your hands out of recycled wood, right? And I was curious if you found any similarities between taking on a challenge like that and kind of learning as you go and putting that all together in real time and kind of creating content and figuring yourself out as who you are as a creator as you go, if there are any parallels that you could draw.
Yeah. One thing about social media that is a challenge for me is it's not very tactile. It's success is not like, like that stack of firewood I mentioned. It's a thing. It's there. You can feel it, right? You can smell it. That's a little bit different. Social media is a little bit more abstract and a little bit more ethereal than that, just because it's on the cloud, right? But I've still felt a sense of great self-respect and dignity in succeeding, right? So it's still there, that sense of pride and sense of ownership. Yeah, the sauna was interesting because that not only was it built that I built it with recycled wood, I designed the whole thing, I made it specifically what I wanted it to be, and I did it out of wood that I took apart, that I took from a shed that I actually demoed. So I bought a property that had a shed on it, and I took the shed down, and as I was doing it, I basically took that shed, pulled it into its constituent elements, and made a fence, a sauna, a treehouse. I did a bunch of stuff with it, right? And I think the parallel that I would draw between the sauna is actually probably just based on the sauna itself, which is that the reason a sauna is good for you is it's a process called xenohormesis, which is a small negative input yields a cascading positive, right? So, for example, the sauna, you couldn't live in there. It's 180 degrees. If you stayed in there for 2 hours, it would not be good for you. But if you stay in there for 15 to 30 minutes, the effects it has on mortality rates and on overall health and well-being, they're very well researched and well documented, right? And I can vouch from my personal experience. So when you're taking on a challenge, I would say, like, for example, building on social media, think about it in terms of, it's another way to say it is medicinal, right? Like if you were to take a whole bottle of aspirin, not good, but one aspirin, actually pretty good, right? Not bad for you, can help you. The point being, there are things that you're going to have to endure that are uncomfortable, difficult conversations, for example, um, working with clients, hard conversations there, or hard decisions that are business related, strategic things that you have to decide about your time. That from the view, they seem negative, but on the other side of them, they have a cascading net positive effect, and that's something that has really been helpful for me to frame, because building businesses is, it requires you to become a better self if you're doing it well. And part of that means leaning into the things that make you a little uncomfortable, right? And that could be different for different people. But I think the point stands that embracing things that are in the short term difficult can have long term positive benefits.
And having that long-term outlook of like the actual goal, it's like having the why. It's a bit trite, but it's true, right? It's like, why
Yeah.
am I doing
Oh, it's so
this?
true.
And it gets you through like some of those short-term bumps. Um, you were, this is kind of a parallel as well, where you were a paid ads expert on X, and you probably still are to some degree. But the reason I say were was because you'd released a course on it, and then very soon after they kind of changed a lot of the platform, and
2 weeks.
yeah, yeah, and it kind of threw a wrench in everything. A lot of what you'd learned and taught kind of like went by the wayside. So I'm curious, what is the state of paid ads right now on X, and how do you recommend people use them now and going forward?
It's a great question. Yeah, that was a monkey wrench for sure. Didn't anticipate it. We talked to X about it directly as well, and it wasn't something they had said that was going to happen. There was really no precursor messages or anything. But that's kind of the method of social media in general. Change is the only constant. One of my mentors said, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, realize that you're going to live in a tent, not in a stone house. You got to be ready to move. And I thought that was really good advice. So it's almost a little bit like when those challenges come, you need to think about them in terms of what they force you to problem solve. Because a lot of times there's an opportunity hidden within them, even if it's hard to see at the moment. And for that specifically, that opened us up to being much more creative with paid ads, utilizing them in different ways across different channels just so that we could deliver results. But one of the easiest ways that I recommend people utilize Twitter ads right now, X ads, is for newsletters. It's still a really a high return move right now to get on and do a website link click. Uh, it's a website link click campaign. And what you do is basically you just funnel people into your newsletter. Newsletters are extremely powerful, and people are sleeping on them still, and I don't understand why. Kieran Drew's a fantastic example of that. And you've seen a lot of the big creators now pushing newsletters. And the reason being is that they're evergreen, that newsletters are something that you get to keep, right? You get to keep that list. And in that way, you kind of take ownership of your audience rather than having your audience owned by, for example, LinkedIn or X. If they decide to deplatform you, you're protected in that case from your core, from losing your core audience. So if I was a new creator, I would say that would be a very easy and really a pretty affordable way. $3 to $5 a day, you can still see results. You know, they're not off the charts, but they're enough to merit the cost, in my opinion.
What kind of costs are you seeing for that? Like if you're spending $3 to $5 and you have decent ad copy and a decent landing page, like what kind of conversions are you seeing? Do you have estimates for that?
Yeah, I was actually not aware of how much the copy matters. That's something that opened me up to. I thought, if you put an ad up, it's going to perform pretty well. There's a huge difference between high performing and low performing. Um, I went to the ADEF conference, and Marketing Max, Marketing Max, he's well known on Twitter, and he pointed out the difference of all of his A/B tests in a presentation. And what he showed was that it was like 85% of his subscribers had come from one, just knocked it out of the park newsletter ad, right? And he tested a bunch of different ones. So my recommendation is to definitely A/B test as much as you can. Now that takes time, that takes some expertise. So I realize that could be an obstacle. If it's keeping you from doing it, I would say don't A/B test them too much, right? I'd rather encourage someone to be proactive and start getting subscriptions, regardless of whether or not it's the highest performing one. But conversion rate, it depends. If you're going first world, it's going to be a little bit expensive, right? You're probably only going to see a handful of subscriptions per week. If you're going global, depending on what you're targeting and for what reason, you're going to see the cost go down, but you're also going to see that it's localized in population centers across the globe. And depending on what your intention is with the newsletter, right? If it's just reach, then global is a fine option. But if you're intending to monetize, which most people are, I would recommend, first world is a good way to start. And the way you would do that is you just select the relevant countries. You can look up a list and then put those countries in when you're targeting. And but yeah, don't be dispelled by low results early on. It's a long game, right? It's a long move. So those handful of subscribers being stacked on a weekly basis, it really adds up, especially if you're in it for the long term.
Yeah, and speaking of the long term, like we talk about these different ways of like being sustainable and finding your why and all these types of things. Gratitude is another one, right? That's kind of an easy hack into just being okay with things taking a little longer or not being as impactful right away. It allows you to enjoy the process. I know your favorite quote ever is by Meister Eckhart, and it says, if the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough. So I'm curious how you balance gratitude every day in this economy, this creator economy that could be so unforgiving.
Well, a very important one is the people you surround yourself with. That's a very important one, right? And that's finding resonance and finding positivity, right? One of the main things is um, my contrarian hot take is that I typically am not very contrarian, right? I don't push a lot of polarizing topics because I don't resonate with taking that position unnecessarily. Um, and for me, it was really important to surround myself with people who are in a similar mode of uplifting positivity, focus, drive, enthusiasm, um, rather than critical or I would say maybe even harsh judgment on a repeated basis. And that's tough though, because you got to surround yourself with people that are going to be long-term partners. You know what I mean? And so I think as far as gratitude on social media, one of the things that really inspires me is recognizing how many people have done it and how many people have really taken and changed their lives, right? Anytime I start to feel down about myself, it's important to look back and to look forward, right? So looking back, one of the things that we have in Legacy Builder is we have a coaching consulting program that we've debated not having just because it is time intensive. But one of the things that it does is it grounds us in the beginning, right? It grounds us in the start, because a lot of the creators we work with they're new creators, right? They're just starting out. They have questions that we had when we first started, and it gives you such a sense of fulfillment and gratitude to know how far you've come. And so that's one that really grounds me if I'm feeling like, yeah, we're not getting anywhere, or we're struggling with this certain thing. That's a really grounding practice. But the opposite is also true, because gratitude it's not just sitting and being content, right? Gratitude, I think, is one of the most highly motivating states you can be in, because it opens you up to looking your vision squarely, right? If you're looking at your vision, but you're still feeling kind of this unrest, you're actually not settled enough to see it clearly. And once you settle yourself, you can see it clearly. And then that typically results in a high state for myself, a highly productive, enthusiastic, motivated, and focused state. And so looking at guys who are just crushing it on all levels, one guy who I've been listening to a lot recently, you should check him out if you haven't, is Eddie Malouf. Fantastic creator. He was at the Client Ascension conference about a month ago. But the man has created a fantastic business. He's done so while still maintaining his heart. He scaled it to just ungodly levels, which are fantastic, right? You just get to see the ceiling just keeps going up. And the piece that really inspires me there is that he is, for all purposes, a very welcoming, warm, grounded, not full of himself person. He's very humble and he's very willing to share, right? And so I think gratitude is a function of your environment, right? Making sure you're set up and you're sleeping appropriately. It's hard to have gratitude if you're hungry, right? Or if you're not sleeping well, or if you're sick. So taking care of your body is a good way to foster gratitude. Your environment, as far as your work environment, do you like where you're working? Are you working in a basement by yourself all day? It's hard to feel too high of gratitude if you're doing that. But then also, it's a function of your extended emotional regulators, which is your tribe, right? Because really that's what they are, meaning when you feel off, you look to your tribe members to orient you back to the appropriate state, right? And so that's, I think, one of the most important features, and one of the most powerful features of X, is that you can find those people. You can surround yourself with those people who resonate deeply with you on that level, and who are able to say, hey, you're down in the dumps. We got this going. Here's what you should focus on. Here's what you should do. Here's your next step. And they call forth that better part of you. And I think it's hard not to be excited about that process.
Yeah, and the real challenge comes when maybe you don't have that great network around you. Maybe you don't have the great job. You are in a place that like objectively kind of sucks. Can you still find gratitude? Can you still dig deep and find the things that are great? Because there's a saying, something along the lines of, the more things you can find gratitude in, the more likely you are to get what you want. Kind of butchering that, but just for more gratitude for what you have, the more gratitude you'll get, the more likely you'll get what you want. So, I love that. And speaking about, what you want, you tweeted last week, what is your Q4 goal for yourself or your business? I know we're coming towards the end of the year here, but I want to spin that around on you and kind of get an idea of where your head's at and how you think about goal setting, but then also what are some of the goals that you have set, and how are you doing on those?
Yeah, it's a great question. Q4 is what I would call a penultimate step. So in the long jump, I was a track athlete in college. In the long jump, the step before liftoff, if you watch, it's actually short, and the runner or the jumper actually squats slightly. And it's a gathering, right? It's a build. They do it in the pole vault, the triple jump, long jump, high jump. It's a gathering, right? And so I would say Q4 for us, what it looks like on a metrics level, our goal is to break 250K in top line revenue generated during Q4 for Legacy Builder. But more importantly, the goal is to outline all of the standards of procedure for all of our processes. To hire, we're currently hiring a couple writers right now to hire some killer copywriters and content writers so that we are ready and prepared to scale. Right now, we're working with I think about 35, maybe 36 clients. And the goal is to get to 50 in either by the end of Q4 or potentially end of January. But then from there to lift off to Q2 with 100 clients. So the goal is to scale this thing. So it's pretty exciting. That's one thing that we've spent some time articulating in detail how we're going to do that. And going back to Tribe, one of the things I cannot recommend enough is finding mentors and asking them, right? And being in a mentor position now myself, when people ask me questions, my goal really is to help them. How can I take the obstacles out of their way so that they can shine, right? And when you find mentors like that, we work with ADAF and with Client Ascension. Um, they can save you months of headache with one call, and it's really the case where the right strategy and the right mindset at the right moment can save you so much time and so much headache and so much energy. And so I'm really grateful for the mentors that we do work with. But Q4 has goals, but I think Q1 is where it's really going to start shining.
That's awesome. I love how dedicated you are to the business. And I do love as well. You mentioned the mindset. Your mindset is incredible. And if you guys aren't following Brett, obviously do that. It's in the description. But the way that you attack the timeline, you say you don't really do a lot of like polarizing stuff. It's very like wholesome and heartfelt and keeps you grounded and keeps your head on straight. And it's very positive. And I can tell, just having talked to you a bunch at this point, that that's authentic to you, and it's really nice to see and to have that mix up on the timeline where it's not always kind of the same stuff. You shine light on who we are and how we should go about it, rather than always just like, here's the next tactical thing. It's like, hey, is your head on straight today? You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
think that's really valuable and it's necessary. And thank you for that, and thank you for coming on the show today, Brett. It's been awesome. I want to give you a chance to maybe share a word of encouragement to people, and maybe something that's on your mind on how you're approaching life. And then if you have anything you want to promote, I'd love to do that as well.
Yeah. A word of encouragement that is coming to mind for me right now is, I would say, self-listening. It sounds kind of trite, but we have this deep neurological faculty of our purpose and our meaning. And when you sit and listen to that, it's very clear. It'll tell you very clearly what the next right steps are. And a lot of times the way that manifests itself is in energy, enthusiasm, focus. What does your mind drift to, right? And I'm very realistic about this also. I know we're busy. We're all busy. But even just taking a few minutes a day to let the waters of your life calm down a little bit and sit and ask myself, what would it look like for me to be the best version of myself, the self that I respect the most, the self that would make the future and the hardships of the future worth enduring without question? That was one of the most powerful things that I started integrating maybe a few years back. Was just a small, you can call it meditation or you can just call it mindfulness, or you can just call it sitting quietly. But spending the time to let yourself feel and visualize, what would it look like for me to live as my apex self? You start living into that and you start getting a sense of what things resonate and what things don't. And the first step is really understanding kind of your internal mechanism for orienting yourself towards your purpose, right? And so if it lights you up, if it makes you enthusiastic, if it makes you proud of yourself, if it brings forth the best of you, focus on those things because they're going to be the things that ultimately you're the best at.
I love it, man. Thank you so much. I really hope everyone's listening closely. And brother, I appreciate you. Thank you for doing the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Greg.